Okay, so within the risk management framework, we build down. Remember our blue boxes, we're building down. So we now come to the risk appetite framework. And that's essentially that's a description of the approach and process through which the risk appetite statement is established, communicated, and implemented. The risk appetite framework is designed to ensure that the bank's strategic plan is reflected in its risk appetite statement and executed in a manner which meets the level of risk acceptable to the board. So this is before we get to the risk appetite statement with the quantitative limits, we have the risk appetite framework. And what's in that? That has definition of how the bank, it defines how the bank's executives monitor compliance with the risk appetite statement. It has a documented escalation process. It has a documented reporting process. And it also describes how the risk appetite statement is embedded within the businesses. It also should describe a process for updating the risk appetite statement on an annual basis. And it should also describe the process for recording enhancements to the risk appetite statement. So that's the risk appetite framework. It does not provide in-depth detail of the risk management framework's policies and protocols. They are in the policy documents and the procedures manuals. This is more the higher level description. The CRO, the Chief Risk Officer, in conjunction with the Executive Management Committee, the EXCO, is responsible for interpreting the board's risk appetite and recording it within the risk appetite statement. Note that the board approves the overall risk appetite. The CRO's office will interpret this and record it within the risk appetite statement, but in close conjunction with the first line of defence. Now, the process for defining appetite at the high level is what I show next. There you go, it's a little 4-arrow process. First of all, we have to identify our risks. I'm going to come to that in a minute. We need to assign key risk indicators, quantitative indicators, to each type of risk. And certain types of risk lend themselves a little bit more easily to having a quantitative indicator assigned to them than other types of risk. And we're going to have a look at that in a second. We have to tie up our risk indicators with our strategic plan. So in other words, the appetite that we set for each indicator should allow us to implement our strategic plan and meet its objectives. And then we set boundaries for monitoring around these limits and escalating if necessary. So that's the process for setting our risk appetite. Reasonably straightforward, I think you'd agree. Okay, in determining the appetite, the risk appetite boundaries, the board and ALCO must consider the following. First of all, the strategic objectives of the bank, absolutely, and also what's in its rolling corporate plan or rolling strategic plan. The current risk capacity, in other words, what is your ability or your not ability, what is the balance sheet's capacity to wear or be exposed to risk today? Because that's going to set your appetite going forward, what you can wear, what you can be exposed to today. How you control, monitor and mitigate this risk exposure, and also have some awareness of your surrounding conditions. Stress testing and scenario analysis are used to assess the financial and management capacity of the bank. So as part of the risk management framework, we have what we've called assurance, and that incorporates the stress testing process. Now, modules 4 and 5 will discuss the liquidity and capital stress testing adequacy, liquidity and capital adequacy stress testing process. Just look at that text at the bottom. It talks about the regulator will always ask the question why limits are at the levels they are, what drives them to be X and not Y. That's a good point to bear in mind. When you set your limits, you should have some process describing why the limits are, describing how the limits have been arrived at, why they've been arrived at the levels they are, and what the driver for this rationale is. So it's important to have that. And so you can answer the question, why is your limit 100 and, as opposed to it could be 95 or 105? Okay, so we should be able to answer that question.